Hello everyone, and welcome to our fifth talk as part of the Evolutionary Dynamics of Religion, Family Size and Child Success seminar series. My name is Joseph Watts, and today I'll be talking about a project modelling secularization across nations using phylogenetic causal path analyses. This research and seminar series was made possible through funding from the John Templeton Foundation. Over the past century, there's been a tenfold increase in the number of people identifying as atheists, agnostics, or having no religion. Combined, these individuals are categorized simply as religiously unaffiliated. Today, around 16% of the world's population are religiously unaffiliated. This means there are more religiously unaffiliated people in the world than either Hindus or Buddhists. This plot shows the proportion of religiously unaffiliated people across countries. The colour scale here has been log transformed to make differences easier to distinguish. One of the things you can see from this plot is that there are striking differences in the proportion of people that are religiously unaffiliated across countries. Less than 1% of the population of Samoa identify as religiously unaffiliated, whereas over half the population of Estonia are religiously unaffiliated. There is also significant geographic patterning in religious unaffiliation. What you can see is in Africa, countries tend to have fewer religiously unaffiliated, while in nations in Europe, there tends to be a higher proportion of religiously unaffiliated. What explains the rise of religious unaffiliation, and why has it been so uneven across countries? In this project, we investigate the factors that contribute to secularization across nations. There are three contemporary families of theories about how to explain cross-population differences in secularization. The first can be traced back to the kinds of rationalist processes proposed by Weber. The argument here is that rationalist and scientific ideologies compete with and come to replace religious concepts of the world. These kinds of theories predict that secularization is related to formal education, as well as exposure to scientific methods and knowledge. The second family of theories proposes that religious systems help people cope with existential insecurities. This is perhaps the most prominent theory today, and has been championed by people like Norris and Engelhardt. This theory predicts that people living in safer and more predictable environments will be less religious. A third family of theories focuses on the functional roles of religions in human life. Religious organizations provide social support networks and mechanisms for reinforcing cooperation. These theories predict that as effective social institutions spread, such as welfare and effective policing systems, there is less need for religion. While these three families of theories aren't strictly incompatible, they are often treated as competing, at least. Distinguishing these three families of theories helps to identify the kinds of factors that are associated with secularization across nations. To test these theories, we built a cross-national data set by aggregating a number of existing data sets. This aggregated data set includes variables on demography, economy, education, and inequality from the UN Human Development Reports. It includes variables on religious affiliation from the World Religion Database and variables on religious attitudes and behaviors from the World Values Survey. The aggregated dataset focuses on the states of nations around the year of 2010, so relatively recent. The aim of this project is to use this aggregated dataset and cross-cultural comparative methods to test theories about secularization across nations. Now, a common issue with performing cross-national or cross-cultural research is that the units of analyses, in this case countries, are not independent. Instead, cultures and nations are related to one another through common ancestry and borrowing. These forms of non-independence violate the assumptions of standard statistical methods and can lead to spurious correlations between traits. Here in the slide, you see a nice little illustration of non-independence of societies that I've pinched from Sean Roberts and colleagues. In this picture, you see an example of how shared ancestry in a sample of cultures can lead to associations between traits. In this example, there are 3 ancestral societies along the top here, each with different color triangles and squares representing cultural traits. Some of the cultures replicate or more prolifically than others, and the descendants of these cultures tend to resemble their ancestors. In the contemporary observable cultures along here, we see blue triangles look like they're associated with red squares. The issue here is that this association is not due to any causal relationship between the traits themselves. Instead, it's simply resulted from historical relationships that exist between the societies being sampled. The challenge this presents for cross-cultural research is to distinguish correlations that arise due to constancy from those associations that arise due to causal relationships between traits. To model the non-independence of societies, we linked nations to a language-based family tree. This tree was built using language classification data from the Glottolog Catalogue of World Languages. This is a simplified tree that represents the classifications of dialects, languages, language subfamilies, and language families. While language families do not perfectly represent cultural histories, they are among the best representation of cultural ancestries that we currently have available. Nations were linked to this tree based on the most widely spoken language within them. You might need a big screen. I'm not sure it'll be very clear over Zoom, but there is clear phylogenetic patterning in the distribution of religious unaffiliation across nations. For example, up here, you see how English-speaking nations all tend to have relatively high levels of religious unaffiliation. In contrast, you can see relatively low rates of religious unaffiliation in Afro-Asiatic languages, which is this sort of family of languages here. The phylogenetic and geographic patterning evident in religious unaffiliation illustrates the importance of adjusting for cultural non-independence within cross-national research. Linking nations to a language-based family tree enables us to use comparative phylogenetic methods, which provide a sort of suite of tools for adjusting for the non-independence of societies. Distance on this tree is also highly correlated with the geographic distances between societies. So here I'm going to treat this tree as providing a general proxy for common ancestry of societies. The first step in this project was to use bivariate phylogenetic analyses to identify what kinds of factors are associated with religious unaffiliation across nations. These associations show what correlations between traits hold after adjusting for common ancestry using that language-based tree. This table shows only some of the variables we tested, and the general picture that emerges is that a wide range of economic and social factors are associated with religious unaffiliation, even after controlling for common ancestry. The challenge really is figuring out how to disentangle the relationships between different factors and figuring out which are the most strongly and causally related factors to religious unaffiliation. Two variables do stand out as particularly strong predictors of religious unaffiliation. Adult literacy rates, which you see here, R squared of 0.25, and HDI, which you see here, which also has a R squared value. Positive association between the HDI and religious unaffiliation has been a major focus of previous cross-national research on secularization. One of the things that our preliminary findings show is that the relationship between HDI and religious unaffiliation does still hold after adjusting for the non-independence of societies, which hasn't been done in previous research. This is not the case for all of the variables we tested. So for example, these measures of corruption you see down here have been effective in previous cross-cultural and cross-national research, but don't seem to hold up after you adjust for common ancestry, at least not in many cases. So you see these relationships are no longer significant here. Now, at this point in the study, we decided to burrow down into the HDI, which stands for Human Development Index, variable. Existing literature has presented HDI as presenting a general measure of societal modernization and human security. The association between HDI and religious unaffiliation has been taken as evidence for existential and security-based explanations of secularization. For example, Norris and Engelhardt argue that HDI is a core measure of societal modernization and human security, and that existential insecurity drives secularization. One issue here is that HDI is itself a compound or composite measure consisting of three indexes. The first is the income index, the second is the education index, and third is the life expectancy index. While the income index and life expectancy indexes are consistent with claims about existential insecurity, the education component is more in keeping with the kind of rationalist explanations of religious unaffiliation that Engelhardt and Norris are actually arguing against. When we separate out the three components of HDI, it becomes apparent that all three components of HDI are correlated with religious unaffiliation. And what's more, these three components of HDI are all highly correlated with one another as well. The correlations shown here all use a language-based phylogeny to adjust for non-independence of societies. However, they still tell us relatively little about the causal relationships that exist between all these different factors. For example, it could be that the three components of HDI all independently predict changes in religious affiliation, as we see in this causal path model on the left. Alternatively, we might expect the effects that the effects of some components of HDI have on religious unaffiliation are mediated by components of HDI. For example, the middle path model here shows the effects of education on religious unaffiliation are fully mediated by the life expectancy index and the income index here. A possible situation is that religious unaffiliation is itself a driver of change in components of HDI. For example, in the path model shown on the right here, religious unaffiliation is causing changes in education. These are all hypothetical models, but they all potentially explain, or they could all potentially explain, the correlations we see between the components of HDI and religious unaffiliation. While standard correlational methods cannot test between these different causal path models, causal path analysis can. Here, and sort of at the heart of this project, we used phylogenetic causal path analyses to model how religious affiliation is causally related to three components of HDI. The R package PhyloPath is an excellent new package that's emerged in recent years and can infer directional dependencies between variables while adjusting for the non-independence of cultures or nations through a language-based family tree. This package is designed to perform confirmatory path analyses, which require the user to define all models that they want to compare. In this project, we extended the functions or methods of PhyloPath to perform exploratory phylogenetic path analyses. These exploratory analyses enable us to systematically compare the fit of all possible model structures. This avoids potential researcher bias resulting from model specifications and enables us to identify under-theorized but potentially important causal relationships between variables. The figures you see here represent a summary of the best fitting models from our exploratory phylogenetic path analyses. The figure on the left represents a summary of the best fitting models from the exploratory path analysis. The figure on the left represents the coefficient estimates of each path, as well as their confidence intervals. And the figure on the right here is a visual representation of the average causal path models. In this best fitting causal model, the central three components of HDI are all directly and causally related to one another. Most importantly, however, what we see is that religious unaffiliation is only directly causally related to the education index. The effects of life expectancy and income indexes on religious affiliation were fully mediated by education, which you see through here. This is only part of the story. Our model also suggests that there is a reciprocal relationship between education, or there is potentially a reciprocal relationship between education and the religious unaffiliation variables. It is possible that education not only has a positive effect on religious unaffiliation, but religious unaffiliation may also have a positive effect on education. These results suggest that the relationship between HDI and religious unaffiliation are not due to a general measure of existential security. If that were the case, and HDI in general was predicting religious unaffiliation, we would expect that life expectancy and income index would also be directly causally related to religious unaffiliation. Instead, the relationship between HDI and religious unaffiliation appears to be driven by the education component of HDI. The pattern of results we see here challenges existential and security-based explanations of secularization and suggests that education is the single most important causal factor from HDI in predicting cross-national differences in secularization. Now, I must emphasize that these results are very much preliminary. We're still investigating them. The next steps for Law and myself will be to look into alternative measures of religious unaffiliation and also investigate other factors that might play into this causal story and see how incorporating them within these analyses impacts the causal story we see emerging. While this project is still a work in progress, I think we can draw a number of tentative conclusions. First, cultural history matters in cross-national or cross-cultural research. Phylogenetic comparative methods provide a way to adjust for this common ancestry. Secondly, causal models can help disentangle complex relationships between variables. For those that are interested in doing these kinds of analyses, I'd thoroughly recommend the R package PhyloPath. It's really rich in its features. Third, the results of our analyses suggest that education is the single most important factor in explaining cross-national differences in secularization today, at least from those we've explored so far. These results fit best with rationalistic accounts of secularization. Now, I must admit, this isn't what I was expecting to find going into this research project, and we're still figuring out exactly why this is the case. So watch this space for updates. To finish, I'd like to thank my collaborators, as well as acknowledge funding from the John Templeton Foundation. This research was part of a broader team project on the evolutionary demography of religion, which you can find out more about on our website, evolutionarydemographyofreligion.org, or by following us on our Twitter account. Now, that's me for today.